I see from your outlook that the IMF has a pretty positive view of Asian economies going forward. Now, what are the reasons, what are the main forces behind this positive view?
This time, the growth momentum is led by large economies such as US, China, and Japan.
Right.
And given that Asia has a large exposure to trade,
Yes.
when this large economic performance is better,
Right.
it definitely benefiting most of the Asian economies.
Right.
And with this background, we forecast that the Asia's growth rate this year will be 5.5% and increasing from the 5.3% of the last year. This growth momentum in advanced economies is quite broad, especially if you look at it. US, given the expectation of fiscal stimulus,
Right.
people are expecting US growth will pick it up. And Europe, definitely we see the cyclical upswinging already. China in the first quarter, the growth rate was 6.9%, much higher than we expected. But the question is that, is it led by the stimulus,
Yeah.
or whether there is a more fundamentally good thing going on? So the issue is that, yes, definitely it's broad-based recovery, but whether it's going to be robust.
Right.
And that one, we have to wait a little bit.
Could you just talk about what are the downside risks that Asian economies face?
First of all, normalization of the U.S. Monetary policy. If the U.S. Growth momentum continues, that will increase the interest rate of the global market.
Right.
And second risk is that if the interest rate goes up, there are many Asian economies which increase its leverage in the last decades.
Yes.
So the high interest cost will probably reduce their growth momentum.
So you're talking about the corporate sector.
Corporate sector and even household debt for several countries. And then also most important downside risk is trade tension.
Right.
The more inward-looking policies of advanced economies. That will definitely affect Asia, which rely heavily on the export.
You mentioned China, and I think a lot of economists expected that China's growth rate would decline or would sort of moderate, but it continues to grow at close to 7%. Now, do you think this is sustainable? And how worried are you about some of the issues that people have raised about China, such as the debt, the considerable amount of debt, and the shadow financial system?
I don't think the hard landing will happen. But on the other hand, we believe that risk is increasing, exactly because of the reason that you mentioned. And we believe around 6.6% growth rate, 6.5% growth rate is good enough growth for China. But if you credit growth is much higher, even though that will help you to have a higher growth rate than mid 6% range, but rapid credit growth can definitely complicate many matters. For example, in the quality of the asset, quality of investment will be a question. Second, the interlinkage between the bank and non-banking sector can be more complicated.
Yes.
So the downside risk can increase.
Yes. And how would it affect the rest of Asia if China were to slow down significantly, if these downside risks come to pass?
At this moment, I think China's growth rate, is not as very low. Actually, China's growth is quite high. So I think the real issue is that what happens if the adjustment of financial market happens abruptly. First of all, I do not believe that this is a real scenario, and I hope that China continue to do the reform to make this risk down. And second, as of now, I think direct impact of financial spillover from China to others is increasing, but it's not direct. Financial markets are rather closed. But on the other hand, this may cause the growth rate of China goes down. That will definitely have impact on Asia through the trade channels.
Another risk you talked about is demographics. I think a lot of Asian countries are facing the issue of aging. Could you tell us which countries do you think are the most vulnerable, and what will be the impact of worsening demographics, and how can countries deal with this problem?
First of all, I think demographic transition in Asia currently is quite heterogeneous. When you say the vulnerability, but a country like Japan, Korea, Singapore are already aged society, so they're already facing the aging problem. On the other hand, if you look at India, Indonesia, Philippines, they still have a demographic so-called dividend. Young population is growing, so it's quite heterogeneous. Then why we are raising this population issue as a medium-term risk? despite of where you are at the demographic transition, we find that the speed of aging is really fast in Asia. So every country, even
China
though
too, right?
China too, China is China, including China. I think by the time when actually most of Asian countries reach the peak of working population, proportion, the income level is not that high. For example, China already reached the working age population already reached the peak, and their income level is only 20% of the U.S.
Right.
And then for India, and when they reach the peak of this working population, we are forecasting that their income level may be 30 to 40% of the U.S. And Vietnam is now already reaching the peak, and they are only 10% of U.S. income. So most of Asian countries, unlike the advanced economies, when advanced economies reach the peak of aging problem, they are reach the 70 to 80% of the U.S. income. In Asia, Japan, Korea, yes, around 70%. But most of the developing Asian countries, by the time when they become old, the income level is well below the 30 to 40% of U.S. income level. That's why we call they have a risk of being old before becoming rich. Yeah. And what does it mean is that they won't have much time to build up social safety net. And then they have to mobilize the money for infrastructure investment for growth. But at the same time, the aging was so rapid, they may not have enough money to prepare for the old age society. So maybe old poverty can be a more serious problem in Asia than any advanced economies world. So this is a big challenge that we want to emphasize. And what they have to do, definitely they have to think about several policies, how to address the fertility rate, how to increase the participation of the workers, especially female workers. And you have to also think about how to make your old workers to continue to be productive. And at the same time, probably Asia need to be a little bit more open-minded to the accepting the immigration. So there are many ways, many areas that Asian policymaker has to focus on. The main lesson that we want to emphasize that before you face the aging problem that is happening in Japan and Korea, it's better to be prepared. Just don't say that you have a demographic dividend. Sooner or later, you will face a similar problem.
A demographic curse, right?
I would say there is a risk of being old before being rich.
Just to talk a little about disruption. I mean, I think this is a theme that is affecting all of us in many economies, many sectors. You look at retail, you look at transportation, you look at even our own sector, the media. You look at many services and even financial services are being disrupted. So, how should economies deal with this problem?
I think in general, I think the debate is whether even though some sectors is disturbed and this job is destroyed, whether this new technology can create additional other job in other sectors. And I think in general, history, if you look at the old historic innovation histories in the past, actually, in industrial revolution in the 1950s, all these, innovations actually make the people very worried about the job security. But the history told us that the creation of job in other sectors actually is well above, bigger than compensating this loss. Whether this will continue for even this new first revolution technology, this is, I think, still in big debate. I'm not an expertise on this issue, so I don't know the reason. Now, unlike the previous industrial revolution or the electronicity, all this gas engines, car, all this innovation, compared with that, now looks like this new innovation is really labor saving, and it will gonna create the same problem. I think history will repeat. This is a $1 million question. Yes. But as an Asia, what I worry about is even if I assume that the job created by this new technology is in general bigger than the job loss destroyed in some sectors, especially manufacturing sectors. As an Asian, I'm a little bit concerned because Asia heavily depends on the labor-intensive manufacturing sector, and even service sector we are very much concentrated in low value-added service sector. Right. So this introduction of robot or new technologies will definitely destroy the jobs in those areas. But can Asia create more jobs? But if you look at the technology leaders, it's mostly in the United States, and or Europe, and even if it's Korea, in Asia it's Korea, Japan, and very few technological leaders. So most of the Asian countries, I think the job creation will be much bigger than by creating this job, unless you really have catching up to this technology.
Yeah.
So I think that is another concern. Even as a global as a whole,
Yes.
maybe new industry can create more job, but it's going to be in Asia.
Yeah.
That one, I think there's more tricky questions.
Can we just talk a little about ASEAN? Singapore is going to chair the ASEAN next year, and I think one of the big challenges going forward is how to accelerate the integration of the ASEAN economies. What is the IMF recommending in this respect?
ASEAN is very important for us and also the global world. And ASEAN's currently maintain around 5% growth rate. And actually ASEAN's performance in the last decade is very stellar. So we believe that and ASEAN is becoming much more important economic player in global world. And Singapore will be an ASEAN chair, but we will also have an annual meeting next year in 2018 in Indonesia. So ASEAN is becoming much more important for us. But I think ASEAN integration has progressed quite significantly in this process. But I believe that the low-hanging fruits of ASEAN integration is already well taken. Now, in order to move up...
Sorry, what were the low-hanging fruits?
So for example, like reducing tariff for manufacturing sectors, kind of thing. But if you think about service sector integration, if you think about human mobility, and those kind of things, is much, the lower level than the European integration. So in my opinion, in order to move this ASEAN integration into upper level, one more level, then I think it's a little more higher ambitions is needed, rather than just enjoying the traditional manufacturing sector tariff reduction. Probably they have to now think about how to enhance the service sector integration and how to enhance the legal and intellectual property and also the procurement. Those kind of more sensitive area of integration will be critical, and it requires a political will.